Здравствуйте, добрый день. Это «Своя игра». Мы продолжаем наш турнир, который называется «Игры золотой девятки». 4-й этап, 4-я игра. За центральным игровым столом сегодня будет играть Максим Дегтярев, эколог из Переяславля-Залесского. Максим член «Золотой девятки». Он будет в этой игре пытаться сохранить за собой свое место в «Золотой девятке». А вот обыграть Максима сегодня будут пытаться за первым игровым столом Татьяна Махова, преподаватель из Мурома. Татьяна Вильевна, расскажите немного о себе.
По образованию я педагог, но в основном работала на мебельном производстве. Сейчас я репетитор. У меня 3 взрослых детей, внук. Я люблю путешествовать, ходить в театр, на концерты, в консерваторию. В своей игре участвовала 2 раза, давно, последний раз 7 лет назад. Поэтому предложение поиграть было очень неожиданным, но очень приятным.
Спасибо. За третьим игровым столом сегодня играет Андрей Кругов, ведущий интеллектуальных игр «Москва». Андрей Викторович, расскажите немного о себе.
Мне 57. Свою игру играю с 2020-го. Сыграл 9 игр, 5 выиграл. В свободное время пишу стихи и песни.
Спасибо. Ну что ж, Татьяна, Максим, Андрей, давайте ознакомимся с темами нашей сегодняшней игры. Вот все они на нашем главном мониторе. Как вы можете убедиться, они прекрасны, как обычно. Самые замечательные темы для вас, уважаемые игроки, и для вас, дорогие телезрители. Мы начинаем первый раунд. Первый раунд. Темы: эврика, кляксы в литературе, фонтаны, общество, посуда и куш в многоточиях. Максим, выбирайте.
Куш за 400.
«Времена не выбирают, в них живут и умирают», написал этот ленинградский поэт. А Сергей и Татьяна Никитины спели.
Кушнер.
Совершенно верно, Александр Кушнер.
Куш 500.
И сразу же аукцион. Вопрос только для вас, Андрей. Коренные жители Камчатки дробят в деревянные ступки смесь из вяленой рыбы, ягод и кедровых орешков. Получается, это блюдо, которое едят сырым или вареным. Тема куш.
Не придумал.
Это блюдо называется толкуша.
Куш 300.
Эту горную систему, одну из самых высоких в мире, отделяет от Памира река Пянш.
Гиндукуш.
Верно, Максим?
Пожалуйста, посуда за 500.
В этом дагестанском ауле придумали медный сосуд нукнус в форме ведерка, перевернув вверх дном основание светильника. Дагестанский поселок, изделие вот такое вот. Никаких версий. Вы когда-нибудь слышали об ауле Кубачи? Вот о нем именно и речь. Кубачи.
Посуда за 400.
В прошлом году выяснилось, что сотрудник этой резиденции президента Франции за 2 года работы украл около 100 предметов посуды. Настоящий несун.
Повар.
Сотрудник этой резиденции. Речь не о профессии сотрудника, а о резиденции.
Елисейский дворец.
Верно, Андрей?
Куш 200.
В XVIII веке Анжелика Дюкудро ездила по Франции, обучая женщин этой своей профессии, и даже придумала особый манекен.
Акушерство.
Верно. Максим?
Куш за 100.
В этом прозвище месяца июля упоминается часть головы. Июль. Куш.
Макушка лета.
Верно. Максим?
Давайте общество за 500.
Дружеское ученое общество было основано в Москве в 1781 году для содействия просвещению в России. Одним из отцов общества был этот журналист и издатель. Николай Новиков.
Фонтаны 500.
Кот в мешке. Кому?
Татьяне.
Татьяна Вильевна, тема профессии. 100 или 500?
500.
500. Внимание на экран. В Рыбинске представителям этой тяжелой и, к счастью, устаревшей профессии установлен памятник.
Ну, допустим, бурлаки.
Верно. Дальше.
Давайте фонтаны 400.
Скульптура китайского художника Ай Вэйвэя «Фонтан света», созданная в 2007 году, отдает дань знаменитому проекту этого советского мастера-авангардиста.
Татлин.
Верно, это башня Татлина.
Давайте кляксы в литературе за 400.
Героя романа Набокова «Пнин» невозможно было заставить увидеть в этих кляксах что-либо интересное. Побег, поморье, полуостров, червей идиотизма, невротические стволы.
Может быть, это кляксы Роршаха?
Совершенно верно! Герой просто отвечал, что это кляксы, и все.
Давайте Эврика за 500.
Аукцион. Вам достается аукцион 300 у Андрея, 500 у Татьяны, 1000 у вас, Максим. Ставка?
Номинал.
500. Играем. Один из его изобретателей, Норман Вудланд, писал, что вдохновлялся азбукой Морзе. Я только расширил точки и тире вниз.
Штрих-код.
Браво! Максим?
Кляксы в литературе за 500.
Кот в мешке. Кому?
Татьяне.
Татьяна, тема «Дела духовные». Ставка?
Ну, 500.
Внимание на экран. В 17-18 веках хождение имела книга, якобы содержащая тайные наставления для членов этого духовного ордена. Современные специалисты не сомневаются, сам орден отношения к наставлениям не имеет.
Ну, пусть иезуиты.
Совершенно верно. Скорее всего, это, наоборот, памфлет, направленный против них. Татьяна, играем дальше.
Эврика за 400.
Чтобы было удобнее писать картины на ветреных Лафатенских островах, шведская художница Анна Бубер придумала приспособление, позволяющее крепить именно его прямо к телу.
Быть может, Мольберт?
Вы правы. Вот это приспособление. Дальше.
Посуда за 300.
Азербайджанский стакан для чая «Армут» получил название за сходство с этим фруктом.
Так, может, это гранат?
Нет. Чего же общего? Форма. Армут по-азербайджански груша. Дальше.
Давайте общество за 300.
Фильм 2013 года «Элитное общество» эта американка сняла при поддержке продюсерской компании отца.
Коппола.
София Коппола, верно.
Кляксы в литературе за 300.
Клякс, помарок и следов от пальцев многое множество описывал он письма мадам Сомовой в своем рассказе 1886 года «Розовый чулок». Чей же это рассказ?
Может быть, Чехова?
Верно.
Фонтаны за 300.
Со 2 февраля нынешнего года желающим полюбоваться этим фонтаном приходится выложить 2 евро. По будням с 11:30, по выходным с 9 до 22:00.
Треви.
Это фонтан Треви, совершенно верно.
Эврика за 300.
Его современную складную конструкцию придумал в начале XVIII века парижский коммерсант Жан Мариус.
Зонтик.
Совершенно верно.
Кляксы в литературе за 200.
Когда дошло дело до чистописания, я от слез, падавших на бумагу, наделал таких клякс, как будто писал водой на оберточной бумаге, писал Лев Толстой в этой повести.
Детство.
Вы правы.
Фонтаны за 200.
В январе нынешнего года началось очередное извержение гавайского вулкана Килауэа. Высота этого фонтана достигала 200 метров.
Лавы.
Верно. Андрей?
Эврика 200.
Патент на легерат, на котором можно было ехать полулежа, был получен в США в начале 20 века. Легерат представляет собой именно это.
Велосипед.
Совершенно верно. Иногда такие и в наше время встречаются.
Общество за 100.
Под этим названием куда больше известно императорское воспитательное общество благородных девиц.
Смольный.
Смольный институт, да.
Посуда 200.
В XIX веке его ставили на стол в сифтере, изящном конусе с отверстиями, и сыпали как соль.
Сахар.
Верно.
Общество за 200.
Это общество не эвакуировалось из блокадного Ленинграда, а исследования его членов помогли проложить дорогу жизни.
Может, географическое общество?
Тогда всесоюзное географическое общество.
Эврика за 100.
Испанский инженер Леонардо Торрес и Киведо разработал канатную дорогу нового типа, и в 1916 году подобное было открыто на этом американском водопаде.
На Ниагарском.
Верно.
Посуда за 100.
Падишах Джахангир однажды отправил слугу, разбившего чашку из этого материала, в Китай за другой такой же.
Из фарфора.
Верно.
Фонтаны за 100.
На Новый год фонтан перед зданием этого театра украсили цветами по мотивам волшебного сада из сказки о Щелкунчике.
Большой.
Верно.
Клякса литературе 100.
Под носом у героя Майдадыра была клякса, а на шее именно она.
Вакс.
Вакса, верно. Это был последний вопрос первого раунда, и я подвожу его итог. 800 на счету у Андрея, ровно 2000 у Татьяны, 2800 на счету у Максима. Впереди второй раунд. Это «Своя игра». Мы в студии, мы разыгрываем второй раунд. Вот его темы. Последние. Нити и нитки. Веломир. Зри в корень. Вопросы от и часы. Андрей, начинайте.
Часы за 1000.
Во дворце Алексея Михайловича в этом Московском музее-заповеднике недавно прошла выставка «Тайна идущего времени». Представлено было множество часов самых разных видов.
Может, в Коломенском?
Верно.
Давайте узнаем, от кого сегодня вопросы.
Добрый день. Меня зовут Настя Чернобровина. Я являюсь советником президента Русского географического общества по информационной политике. Сегодня наши эксперты подготовили для вас вопросы на тему «Япония».
Вопросы от Русского географического общества за 1000.
Археолог Юсуки Кайфу решил доказать, что первобытные жители Тайваня могли доплывать до Японии. И за 2 суток прошел с друзьями на самодельной пироге 200 километров до острова Йонагуни, самого западного из этих японских островов.
Острова Рюкю.
Верно.
Вопросы от Русского географического общества за 800.
Тайные общины Какура-Кириситан действовали более 200 лет, несмотря на гонения и казни, вплоть до середины XIX века, когда это, наконец, было разрешено.
Христианство.
Исповедовать христианство, верно. Максим.
Киришитан. Пожалуйста, часы за 800.
Часы павлин, заказанные Григорием Потемкиным, до 1797 года стояли в этом дворце, а уже потом переехали в Эрмитаж. В Таврическом Дальше.
Вопросы от Русского географического общества за 600.
В этом искусстве представители школы Соггэцу могут включить в композицию и предметы из металла, пластика или ткани.
Максим?
Икебана.
Верно.
Вопросы от Русского географического общества за 400.
В комнату для этой церемонии ведет узкий и низкий вход, вынуждающий поклониться каждого входящего.
Чайная церемония.
Вы правы.
Нити и нитки за 1000.
На катушках с нитками можно увидеть числа от 10 до 150, обозначающие именно это.
Быть может, сколько метров нитки осталось?
Нет.
Количество витков?
Нет. Татьяна?
Толщину нити.
Совершенно верно. Чем выше число, тем тоньше нить.
Нити и нитки 800.
И даже тоненькую нить не в состоянии разрубить стальной клинок. Песня волшебника в исполнении Леонида Серебренникова звучит в этом телефильме.
Обыкновенное чудо.
Верно.
Веломир за 1000.
Солнце на спицах, синева над головой, ветер нам в лица, обгоняем шар земной. В 1969 году песенка велосипедистов была в репертуаре этого вокально-инструментального ансамбля. Эту песню пели поющие гитары.
Последние за 1000.
Карл IV французский скончался в 1328 году, не оставив сыновей, и стал последним королем из этой династии.
Капетинги.
Капетинги, да, совершенно верно.
Последние 800.
Переведя эту шумерскую поэму, Николай Гумилев преподнес один экземпляр Александру Блоку с дарственной надписью «Последнему лирику первый эпос».
Эпос о Гильгамеше.
Верно.
Зри в корень за 1000.
В Европе любители сладостей издавна жевали сушеные корни этого растения. Приверженцы здорового питания и сегодня покупают их в целом виде. А в популярных конфетах применяется экстракт.
Лакрица.
Лакрица, совершенно верно, она же солодка. Дальше.
Давайте веломир за 800.
Этот премьер-министр Армении обожает ездить на велосипеде. Совершал велопробег вокруг Сивана, да и по Москве прокатиться не преминул.
Никол Пашинян.
Верно.
Зри в корень за 800.
Бактерии, живущие в особых клубеньках на корнях бобовых растений, превращают этот газ из атмосферы в необходимые растению вещества.
Азот.
Совершенно верно.
Вопросы от Русского географического общества за 200.
Последний раз этот вулкан извергался в 1707 году.
Фудзияма.
Совершенно верно. Было много пепла, но лавы не было.
Зри в корень за 600.
Аукцион. 800 у Андрея, 5400 у вас, Татьяна, 7600 у Максима.
1000.
1000. Максим?
6600.
Играем. Рекордный корень этого растения вырастили не в Китае, а в штате Вашингтон. 920 граммов.
Женьшень.
Верно. Максим?
Веломир за 600.
Этому виду искусства, в котором велосипед активно используется, посвящено панно в одном из детских садов набережных Челнов. Это панно посвящено цирку. Дальше.
Последние за 600.
В 2021 году на российские экраны вышло сразу 2 фильма из этой трилогии корень зла и посланник тьмы. Последний богатырь.
Нити и нитки за 600.
Этот фразеологизм означает хорошо заметный обман, неумело замаскированную халтуру. 3 фальстарта.
Шито белыми нитками.
Верно.
Часы за 600.
В латвийском городе Лиепая можно полюбоваться на большие песочные часы. Только вместо песка в них насыпано именно это.
Наверное, янтарная крошка.
Янтарь, верно. Вряд ли эти часы могут измерять время. Это скорее арт-объект.
Нити и нитки за 400.
Именно от нее Тесей получил клубок ниток, который помог герою выбраться из лабиринта Минотавра.
Рядно.
Верно.
Часы 400.
Старейшие в мире такие часы, работающие по сей день, были созданы в 1505 году в Нюрнберге слесарем и часовщиком Петером Хенляйном.
Наверное, механические часы.
Нет.
Башенные часы.
Нет. В 1505 году...
Трудный выбор, ну пусть карманные.
Браво!
Зри в корень 400.
По словам Дениски Кораблева, в этом стихотворении Лермонтов хотел сказать, что сосна – морозоустойчивое растение и обладает сверхмощным стержневым корнем.
На севере Диком
Совершенно верно. Шутил под впечатлением от урока литературы, который провела учительница естествознания.
последний 400.
Британский искусствовед Джон Рёскин посвятил этому городу книгу «Последний приют святого Марка».
Венеция?
Конечно.
Часы 200.
2 ноября 1917 года эти часы остановились во время уличных боев красногвардейцев с юнкерами Александровского училища.
На Спасской башне?
Верно.
Веломер 400.
Пару лет назад мэр Тронхейма Кент Ранум проиграл спор мэру этой столицы и, согласно условиям, вынужден был добираться до нее на велосипеде. Путешествие заняло 3 дня.
Осло.
Совершенно верно. Ранум уверял, что женский футбольный клуб из Тронхейма непременно победит команду из Осло, но не тут-то было.
Последние за 200.
Кот в мешке. 5000 у Татьяны, 2600 у Андрея, 15400 у вас. Кому отдадите?
Андрея.
Андрей, тема «Полководцы». В этом раунде 200 или 1000.
1000.
Этот советский военачальник командовал объединенными советско-монгольскими силами во время конфликта с японцами на Халхинголе. В Монголии сейчас есть его музей.
Это Жуков.
Совершенно верно. Андрей?
Зри в корень 200.
Этот корень в Белгородской области прежде носил название «мокрый корень».
Может, он стал сухой корень?
Этот корень. Что это за объект в Белгородской области?
Населенный пункт?
Нет. Это река. Просто река.
Нити и нитки 200.
В зависимости от размера из него можно вытянуть от 300 до 1500 метров шелковой нити.
Кокон шелкопряда.
Верно.
И веломир за 200.
У велосипеда они могут быть ободными, дисковыми и барабанными.
Может, тормоза?
Верно. Завершаем наш второй раунд замечательным словом «тормоза». Подвожу его итог. 3600 на счету у Андрея, ровно 5 у Татьяны, 15600 у Максима. Впереди 3-й раунд. Это «Своя игра», мы разыгрываем 3-й раунд. Темы: прозвища, соборы и церкви, по коням, железная тема, в переводе и шары. Андрей Викторович, начинайте.
Шары 1500.
В романе Сидни Шелдона «Мельницы богов» сотни воздушных шаров под потолком посольства должны были взорваться. За минуты до трагедии герои спасли всех, использовав эту особенность крыши.
Возможно, она раздвижная.
Совершенно верно, она была раздвижная. Створки раздвинули, шары взлетели и взорвались уже в небе.
Железная тема 1500.
Это метательное копье с железным наконечником на Руси использовали и в ближнем бою.
С улицы.
Верно, это с улицы.
По коням 1500.
Эту химическую кличку носил конь, который трижды помог Николаю Насибову выиграть скачки на приз Европы. Уникальный результат. Коня звали Анилин.
Собор и церкви 1500.
Монастырь святой Екатерины на Синае основан в IV веке, а его главный собор, базилика Преображения, воздвигнут через 2 столетия по воле этого императора.
Ну, может, Константин Великий?
Нет, вы не поняли. Константин Великий как раз жил в IV веке, а базилика, как сказано в вопросе, была основана через 2 столетия после этого.
Может, Юстиниан?
Это правильный ответ.
Давайте сыграем шары за 1200.
Этот заглавный герой кукольного советского мультфильма был лошадкой, собранной из жонглерских шаров.
Это лошарик.
Верно.
А шары за 900.
Внутри верхнего шара брюссельского атомиума уставших туристов радует не только обзорная площадка, но и это заведение.
Ресторан, наверное.
Верно.
Прозвище 1500.
Этого руководителя нашей страны народ окрестил кучером.
Черненко.
Константин Устинович Черненко, да, по инициалам.
В переводе 1500.
Кот в мешке. 5000 у Татьяны, ровно 6 у Андрея, 19 800 у вас.
Татьяне.
Татьяна, тема «Книжный мир». 300 или 1,5?
1,5.
В необычном издании романа «451 градус по Фаренгейту» вместо цифры 1 в обложку вставили этот предмет. Неужели как руководство к действию?
Спичку.
Давайте посмотрим. Совершенно верно. Татьяна, играйте.
Соборы и церкви за 1200.
Вид на собор в Солсбери он написал в 1831 году.
Констебл.
Джон Констебл, верно.
Давайте прозвище за 1200.
А вот и аукцион. 6000 у Андрея, 7700 у вас, 19 800 у Максима.
1500.
То есть выиграть вы не хотите. Хорошо, Андрей.
Ва-банк.
Ва-банк, естественно. Татьяна, не возражаете?
Нет, не возражаю.
Максим?
Пас.
Играем с Андреем. За вязкую, запутывающую соперников манеру игры британский шахматист Майкл Адамс получил это прозвище, словно герой комиксов.
Ну, пусть Человек-паук.
Верно!
В переводе 1200.
По этой команде судьи фехтовальщики начинают поединок. С французского ее можно перевести как «идите».
Антре.
Нет. Алле.
Железная тема 1200.
Вокруг железного и чугуноплавильного завода промышленников Баташовых выросло это поселение, ныне расположенное в Рязанской области.
Гусь железный.
Совершенно верно. Река Гусь.
По коням за 1200.
Эти специалисты, обучавшие верховой езде, в XIX веке служили в каждом кавалерийском полку, а самих их обучали в особой школе в Санкт-Петербурге. Они назывались берейторы. Дальше.
Собор и церкви за 900.
В соборе Сен-Пьер в этом швейцарском городе сохранился необычный треугольный стул Жана Кальвина, который пламенно проповедовал в соборе собственное учение.
Женева.
Верно.
В переводе 900.
В японской технике раден лаковые изделия инкрустируют перламутром. Слово «раз» японского переводится именно так. Частичное созвучие с русским словом, конечно, случайно.
Ракушка.
Раковина, да.
Прозвище за 900.
Этих пушистых хулиганов в США прозвали трэш-пандас, мусорные панды.
Енот.
Совершенно верно.
Железная тема 900.
В 1632 году голландский купец Андрей Виниус после обнаружения под этим русским городом доброй руды приобрел права на постройку железоделательного завода и быстро разбогател. Какой город?
Ну, пусть Курск.
Нет. Это Тула.
Железная тема 600.
Этот термин ввел в работе 1836 года датский археолог Кристиан Томпсон.
Железный век.
Вы правы.
По коням 900.
Аукцион. 12 ровно у Андрея, 8600 у Татьяны, 21 300 у вас, Максим.
12300.
Играем. По этой причине полковник Покровский в исполнении Валентина Гафта приостановил марш гусарского полка по городу Губернску и повернул полк на другую улицу.
Я, конечно, не смотрел. Может, там ребенок шел по этой стороне улицы?
Что бы ответили вы, Татьяна?
По-моему, там утки шли или кто-то.
Что бы
из
ответили
зверей.
вы, Андрей?
Черная кошка перебежал.
Совершенно верно. Перед его конем пробежал черный кот. Фильм о бедном гусаре «Замолвите слово», конечно же.
Прозвище 600.
Увы, вопрос придется отдать. Кому?
Татьяне.
Татьяна, тема «Наполеон Бонапарт». Ставка.
Ну, 1,5.
Внимание на экран. Французский художник XIX века Жан-Леон Жером изобразил Наполеона перед этой знаменитой статуей, которую вы пока не видите.
Ну, скорее всего, сфинкс.
Давайте посмотрим. Плюс 1500.
Спасибо. Давайте в переводе за 600.
Название горной области Домбай на Кавказе в переводе с абазинского языка означает именно это животное. Копытные гиганты действительно здесь некогда водились.
Может, тур?
Нет. Это зубр. Играем дальше.
Соборы и церкви за 600.
Церковь Богоявления на Гутуевском острове Санкт-Петербурга была заложена в 1892 году в память этого чудесного спасения, произошедшего далеко от столицы.
Крушение поезда.
В память этого чудесного спасения...
Ну, там Александр держал...
Вот этого спасения.
Да.
Нет, это совершенно другой сюжет.
Мне кажется, это когда царевича Николая напали в Японии на него.
Совершенно верно.
Прозвище 300.
Герой романа Нарине Абгарян Манюня прозвал свой вездеход ГАЗ-69 Васей в честь работавшего на Горьковском заводе конструктора с этой фамилией, прекрасно известной поклонникам своей игры.
Вассерман.
Совершенно верно. Григорий Моисеевич Вассерман. Максим?
Шары за 600.
Мы гуляли по Неглинной, заходили на бульвар, нам купили синий-синий призеленый красный шар. Какого цвета шар купили в его стихотворении, а что у вас, сразу и не поймешь. Чье стихотворение?
Михалкова.
Верно.
По коням за 600.
Надпись на скульптуре жеребца по кличке Марс подтверждает. Именно на Марсе он въехал в Париж. Вопреки легенде, утверждающей, что под ним был подаренный некогда Наполеоном конь Эклипс.
Александр I.
Совершенно верно.
Железная тема 300.
В мультфильме 2013 года он вступил в союз с Халком, а в мультфильме следующего года с Капитаном Америкой.
Железный человек.
Верно.
Шары за 300.
В его головоломке, представленной в 2009 году, нужно загнать каждый из 6 шаров в лунку своего цвета.
Эрнё Рубик.
Браво!
По коням за 300.
2 коня у меня, 2 коня. По воде они возят меня. А вода тверда, словно каменная. Отгадайте загадку Корнея Чуковского.
Коньки.
Верно.
Собор и церкви за 300.
В этом штате США есть лютеранская церковь Спасителя. И северное сияние здесь не редкость.
Аляска.
Совершенно верно. Церковь расположена в городе Ном.
В переводе за 300.
Такие годы сербы называют «преступна година», хотя ничего незаконного в них нет.
Високосная.
Совершенно верно. Ну что ж, давайте подведем итог. После 3-го раунда 10 400 у Татьяны, на 100 больше у Максима, 10,5, 12 600 у Андрея. Все решится в финальном раунде. Своя игра, финальный раунд. Темы. Песни вокруг спорта, Библии и жизнь, генералы, одежда, вена, птицы. Прошу вас, Татьяна, уберите любую тему.
Генералы.
Максим, ваша очередь.
Песни.
Андрей.
Вокруг спорт.
Татьяна.
Птицы.
Максим.
Библия и жизнь.
Андрей.
Одежда.
Выбрана тема вена, уважаемые игроки. Делайте, пожалуйста, ваши ставки. Ставки сделаны, тема вена, и вот вопрос. Уже по названию нового произведения венская публика понимала, что речь пойдет не о зоологии. Ведь на маскарадах 1870-х этот костюм был очень популярен. Время. Ну что ж, время истекло. Ответ Татьяны. Карнавал. Речь не о зоологии. Да нет, конечно. Ответ неверный. Ставка. Ва-банк. Да. Ответ Максима. Собачий вальс. Неверно. Ставка. Ва-банк. Что же у нас такое получается-то? Ответ Андрея. Лебединое озеро. Ерунда полная. Ставка. 12 401. И с мизерным результатом Андрей Викторович Кругов, ведущий интеллектуальных игр из Москвы, все-таки побеждает в нашей сегодняшней игре. Вы уже поняли, о каком произведении идет речь? О знаменитой оперете Иоганна Штрауса «Летучая мышь». Конечно же. «Летучая мышь». Этот костюм был удивительно популярен на маскарадах 1870-х годов. Татьяна, Максим, большое спасибо за игру. Андрей, вот с таким вот результатом вы попадаете все-таки в золотую девятку. В финал вы вряд ли пройдете, но все-таки вы в золотой девятке. Дорогие друзья, огромное вам спасибо за внимание. Всего доброго. Увидимся. Пока.
The mystery surrounding Nolan Wells has suddenly surged back into the spotlight, and this time the pressure around the case feels heavier, louder, and far more dangerous. Federal authorities are now examining threats made against the people believed to have been with Nolan in the final hours before the Mississippi teenager disappeared and was later found dead, a chilling twist that has added an even darker dimension to an already haunting story. Nolan Wells, just 18 years old, vanished on July 4th after joining friends for a holiday boat trip to Horn Island, a remote barrier island off Mississippi's Gulf Coast. Search teams combed the island and surrounding waters for 2 agonizing days before a National Park Service ranger found his remains near the island's northwestern tip on July 6th. Since then, the case has become a storm of heartbreak, suspicion, conflicting stories, and mounting public outrage. And now, after weeks of stalled answers and unbearable silence, multiple developments have arrived all at once, making it impossible to ignore that this case is entering a far more explosive phase. What makes this moment feel so significant is not just the FBI's confirmed presence, but the fact that nearly every key thread in the story appears to be tightening at the same time. A young woman connected to the biggest unanswered question in Nolan's last known movements has finally come forward and reportedly spoken directly with his mother. New boat audio and GPS information have surfaced, helping investigators reconstruct the July 4th timeline in sharper detail than ever before. Federal authorities have now formally documented their role, not only in connection to the investigation itself, but in response to threats serious enough to cross into federal territory. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the people closest to Nolan's final hours still do not appear to be telling one clean, consistent story. What began as a missing person case has hardened into something far more disturbing, and the closer the public looks, the more the contradictions refuse to disappear. Before the case became a national headline, before television cameras and legal statements and social media speculation turned Nolan's name into a public rallying cry, there was simply a family. Nolan Xavier Wells grew up in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, a Gulf Coast town where sports, school, church, and community still shape the rhythm of life. People who knew him described him in a way that rarely happens unless the person truly lived up to the reputation. Whether they were teachers, coaches, classmates, or family friends, the language surrounding Nolan was remarkably similar. He was kind. He was respectful. He was disciplined. He was the type of young man who stood out not because he demanded attention, but because his character kept showing up in every room he entered. He was one of 6 children raised by Christine Wansley and Elmore Wansley, growing up alongside siblings in a home that, by every public account, centered values, structure, and loyalty. His father has spoken about him in a way that has stayed with people following the case because it gives such a clear sense of who Nolan was supposed to be in the world. Elmore described his son as a silent leader, the kind of person who did not need applause to do the right thing. He was not interested in performance. He was interested in being solid, reliable, and present. That image has become especially painful in hindsight because one of the lessons Elmore said he drilled into Nolan day after day was simple and unmistakable. If you go somewhere with a group, you stay with that group. You do not leave people behind, and you do not allow yourself to be left behind. It was the kind of parental rule that sounds almost obvious until a tragedy turns it into the most devastating line in the story. Because that exact rule now hangs over everything that happened on Horn Island with almost unbearable weight. At Ocean Springs High School, Nolan was known as a multi-sport athlete, but football was where his talent and discipline seemed to shine most clearly. He played wide receiver, a position that requires more than physical skill. It demands timing, awareness, trust, and the ability to move with precision even when the spotlight is elsewhere. His coaches did not remember him by leading with statistics or flashy highlight reels. Instead, they talked about the way he carried himself. His football coach, Jake Bramlett, said Nolan led through example, not volume. He was not the loudest player in the room, but he was often the one others naturally followed because his consistency spoke for him. His principal, Dr. Jacob Dykes, echoed that image, describing Nolan as one of the kindest and hardest-working young people to come through the school. Those tributes were not polished public relations lines. They felt personal, grounded, and heartbreakingly believable. One of the stories Christine Wansley has shared about her son has become one of the clearest windows into the kind of person he really was. In a math class, a student with special needs was given a chance to answer a question. Before the usual rush of raised hands could overwhelm the moment, Nolan quietly encouraged the rest of the class to put their hands down, making space for her to answer without pressure and without feeling rushed or outcompete. When she got it right, he celebrated her success sincerely. It was not a performance. It was not a stunt. It was instinctive kindness. The teacher was so moved that she contacted Christine afterward to tell her what had happened. That story has lingered because it cuts through the noise of headlines and investigations and reminds everyone that Nolan was not just a case file, not just a viral name, not just a face in a photograph from a holiday weekend. He was a young man whose goodness seemed to show up quietly, naturally, and consistently. Christine has said that Nolan had such a big heart that she sometimes worried the world would not always know what to do with it. That comment now lands with haunting force. By the summer of 2026, Nolan had already started building the future people believed he deserved. He had earned a position as a wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College, and the Monday after the 4th of July weekend, he was scheduled to report to football camp. His parents were preparing to take him back. His life was moving forward with structure and purpose. There was a next chapter already waiting for him. This was not a young man drifting without direction or living recklessly in the margins. He had commitments. He had plans. He had momentum. He was on the edge of something new, which makes the events of that holiday weekend feel even more cruel. He was supposed to be arriving at practice, not becoming the center of a mystery. Horn Island, where Nolan was last seen alive, does not look like the sort of place people associate with tragedy. On the surface, it looks like escape. The island sits roughly 10 miles off Mississippi's Gulf Coast, south of Pascagoula, within the Gulf Islands National Seashore, a federally protected chain of barrier islands known for white sand, open skies, and the kind of isolation that feels beautiful until something goes wrong. There are no roads, no hotels, no stores, no ordinary signs of civilization. The only way to get there is by private boat, and the only way back is the same. It is the kind of destination that draws holiday crowds looking for a carefree day on the water, especially on a weekend like the 4th of July. People anchor, swim, gather in groups, take pictures, drink, socialize, and head home before evening. Nolan had reportedly been there before. There was nothing inherently unusual about him spending that day there with friends. On the morning of July 4th, 2026, the trip began like any other holiday outing. The group gathered at Warren Hudson's dock, where surveillance footage later made public showed nearly 24 people moving around 3 boats in preparation for the trip. In hindsight, those images are unsettling in the way all ordinary footage becomes unsettling once you know what came next. Nothing in the video looks suspicious or dramatic. It looks like summer. It looks like youth. It looks like a crowd of people expecting nothing more serious than sun, water, and a long afternoon off the mainland. But that dock footage has become one of the earliest and most important visual anchors in the case because it captures the last moments before the day began splitting into different versions depending on who is telling the story. GPS data later obtained from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources and reported by CBS News provided the clearest factual timeline of the boat's movement. According to those records, the vessel departed the private dock at 9:56 a.m. and reached Horn Island at 11:14 a.m. The journey out took a little over an hour, a routine crossing for a Gulf Coast holiday trip. Once on the island, Nolan appeared in photographs that now take on an eerie, heartbreaking quality. In one image, He stands smiling in blue swim trunks, sunglasses on, his arm casually around someone beside him. He looks completely at ease, exactly what he was supposed to be that day, an 18-year-old spending a summer holiday with people he knew on an island he had visited before. Nothing in those images foreshadows panic. Nothing suggests danger. Nothing hints that the final confirmed afternoon of his life is already unfolding in silence. The last confirmed sighting of Nolan has consistently been placed somewhere between 3 and 4 p.m. on July 4th, though the precise moment shifts depending on which statement is being examined. That hour, however, has become the emotional and investigative center of the case. Somewhere in that window, something happened, something was misunderstood, or something was ignored. At 4:31 p.m., the GPS shows the boat departing Horn Island. Nolan was not on it. His phone was. His keys were. He was not. Few details in this case have struck the public as forcefully as that one, because it does not sound like a legal puzzle so much as a deeply human failure. If someone leaves an island without the person they arrived with, while that person's belongings remain aboard, the obvious questions come instantly. Who noticed? Who cared? Who assumed he would be fine? Who decided to go anyway? The GPS record continues after that. The boat moved into Fort Bayou at 5:52 p.m. and returned to the private dock at 6:06 p.m. At approximately 7:19 p.m., the vessel was moved again. Those records tell investigators where the boat was and when it moved, but they do not answer the question that matters most. What happened between the last confirmed sighting of Nolan and the moment that engine turned over to leave him behind? That stretch of time, from somewhere around 3 p.m. to 4:31 p.m., is the black hole at the center of the case. Every interview, every legal maneuver, every press conference, every social media theory, every federal development, and every emotional demand for answers leads right back to that one unexplained window. As public attention intensified, the natural question became obvious. Who exactly was there? And what are they saying now? That is where the case becomes increasingly tangled. Several people tied to Nolan's group have been publicly identified. Some have spoken. Some have gone quiet. Some have hired attorneys. And the accounts currently on the record do not fit together neatly. Warren Hudson, who described himself as Nolan's best friend, has offered one of the most detailed public narratives so far. Hudson was present at the dock the morning of July 4th, though reports indicate he did not travel out to Horn Island on the exact same boat Nolan used. He did, however, have contact with Nolan on the island during the day, and after Nolan's body was discovered, Hudson sat down publicly with podcast host Brandon Tatum and later returned to Horn Island with him to retrace the day. Hudson's version of events is central because it attempts to answer the question that has tormented the public since the beginning. Why did Nolan not get back on the boat? According to Hudson, the group tried multiple times to get Nolan aboard before they left, and Nolan allegedly refused every time. Hudson said Nolan had met a girl on the island and wanted to stay with her. In that telling, Nolan was not forgotten, abandoned, or stranded. He made a decision to remain behind. Hudson also addressed the phone issue directly, saying that people around the water commonly left their phones on the boat to protect them from damage. He presented Nolan's phone being left behind as routine rather than suspicious. Whether that explanation lands convincingly with the public is another matter entirely, but it remains one of the core pieces of the friend group narrative. Hudson also said that once the group returned to the mainland and Nolan still had not contacted anyone, he personally called Christine Wansley. According to Hudson, the call lasted about 5 minutes. He told her not to panic and then contacted the Coast Guard because, as someone raised on the Gulf Coast, he understood how quickly a dangerous situation on the water can escalate. Hudson later joined the search efforts the following morning. He also emphasized that Horn Island, while undeniably beautiful, carries risks that people unfamiliar with the area may underestimate. He reportedly said that others had died there before Nolan, suggesting that the island's natural hazards should not be dismissed. But even if that is true, the public unease has never been solely about the island. It has always been about the people. It has always been about the decision to leave. Another key name in the case is Wyatt Pyron, one of the friends who was reportedly on the boat with Nolan. The vessel used for the July 4th trip belonged to his family, and that made his relatives directly relevant to the investigation. His grandfather, Jerry Utterson, and his mother, Jennifer Pyron, were both contacted by authorities. On July 8th, Utterson signed a formal permission to search document, giving investigators access to the boat and authority to remove relevant items or records. GPS data was extracted from that vessel. Investigators also obtained data from another boat belonging to Bart Edmond Jr., which had also been present in the area that day. Those details matter because they suggest law enforcement was not relying purely on memory or statements. They were trying to construct an evidence-based timeline through physical and electronic records. In a case driven by conflicting human recollections, that distinction is crucial. Both Wyatt Pyron and Warren Hudson have since retained private defense attorneys, a move that immediately triggered public reaction. Legally speaking, hiring a lawyer proves nothing. It does not mean someone is guilty, and it does not amount to a confession of wrongdoing. In a case attracting this level of scrutiny, legal counsel is an unsurprising step. But in the court of public perception, it changed the energy. It signaled that two of the most closely watched figures connected to Nolan's final hours were no longer approaching the case as young men casually explaining a tragic misunderstanding. They were responding through legal protection. That may be prudent. It may be necessary. But it also deepened the sense that what happened on that island has implications serious enough for everyone involved to start thinking like defendants, even before any charges exist. Then there is Warren Cole, another young man connected to the events of that day. Because the case involves both Warren Hudson and Warren Cole, public reporting has occasionally created confusion, but they are not the same person. Warren Cole is the son of Chancery Judge Ashley Cole, whose public statement brought his role into focus. Judge Cole confirmed that her son had been on Horn Island and had been interviewed by the Jackson County Sheriff's Department. She insisted that no member of her family had interfered with the investigation in any way. According to Judge Cole, her son told her that he last saw Nolan around 3 p.m., at which point Nolan allegedly said he intended to return to the mainland with a different group of friends rather than the boat he had arrived on. That version, if accurate, potentially explains why some people may not have thought immediate alarm was necessary. But it also introduces a new complication. If Nolan had another ride arranged, who was that group, and why has no one confirmed a plan that actually materialized? Judge Cole also revealed that she deactivated her social media accounts after Nolan's death because of the emotional intensity online and fears for her children's safety. That comment speaks volumes about the climate surrounding the case. Public pressure has not remained confined to questions and commentary. It has escalated into something far more personal, which now appears to include real threats serious enough to draw federal involvement. Several others tied to the broader social circle on Horn Island that day have also been identified publicly, including Eli Jax Patalo, Eric Alcantara, and Morgan Seymour. Reports say all three, along with Hudson and Pyron, switched their social media accounts to private in the days after Nolan's death. None of them have given public statements. That silence may be legally wise, but in a case this emotionally volatile, silence often becomes its own kind of story. One of the moments that intensified public suspicion was the circulation of a video online that appeared to capture a chaotic confrontation. In the clip, a voice could be heard during what sounded like a heated dispute, and attorney Ben Crump stated publicly that he believed Nolan could be heard demanding his phone back. That interpretation spread rapidly because it seemed to offer something visceral and immediate, a piece of evidence that connected rage, conflict, and Nolan's missing phone in a way the public could instantly grasp. But then Traciston Shepard, a high school friend of Nolan's, came forward and said the voice in the video was his, not Nolan's. Shepard explained that the footage showed him arguing with a stranger after a physical altercation, and that the words people had interpreted as a demand for a phone were actually him demanding to be let off the boat, so he could continue the fight. Shepard also clarified that Nolan was not visible in the video, and that the footage had nothing to do with Nolan's disappearance or with any argument over Nolan's phone. That statement should have cooled some of the speculation, but in a case like this, once an image or clip becomes attached to a theory, it rarely disappears cleanly. The episode became a striking example of how quickly unverified material can move from internet chatter into formal legal commentary and public belief. Even when corrected, the emotional residue remains. And in a case already loaded with pain and mistrust, the damage from early misinterpretations can linger well beyond the facts. Then there is Katie McCormick. The 19-year-old woman Nolan had reportedly been spending time with on Horn Island shortly before the boats began leaving. She was on the island with a separate group of friends, not the same group Nolan arrived with. Katie has not spoken publicly herself, but her identity was reported by the Daily Mail, and her sister, Gracie McCormick, has spoken on her behalf. According to Gracie, Katie had a conversation with Nolan during which she believed he was preparing to return to the boat he came on. Gracie said Katie assumed Nolan's friends would not leave without him. That detail is enormously important because it stands in tension with the story that Nolan repeatedly refused to get on the boat. If Katie thought he was headed back to his group, then either Nolan communicated different things to different people, or someone's version of events is incomplete. Katie later left Horn Island with her brother and his fiancé. Gracie has said the McCormick family cooperated fully with investigators and with the Wells family. Before Katie was correctly identified, investigators reportedly visited the home of a woman named Lainey, who had initially been misidentified in reports connected to this part of the story. That lead turned out to be wrong, and Katie McCormick was ultimately confirmed as the young woman Nolan had been spending time with. The mistaken identity may sound like a side note, but it reveals just how chaotic and uncertain the early phase of the case really was. Even central figures in Nolan's last known afternoon were not immediately and accurately identified, which only fed public anxiety about whether the right questions were being asked quickly enough. So this is where the public record stood. Warren Hudson said Nolan was asked more than once to get on the boat, and chose not to. Warren Cole, through Judge Ashley Cole, said Nolan indicated he intended to leave with a different group. Gracie McCormick, speaking for Katie, said Katie believed Nolan was heading back to his own boat and had no reason to think he would be stranded. Those are three versions of Nolan's intentions, and they do not line up neatly. Ben Crump addressed that contradiction directly, saying that Katie's account and the friend group's account could not both be fully right in the same way. If Katie believed Nolan was returning to his boat while the others insist he refused to do so, then somebody is misunderstanding something, misremembering something, or failing to say everything they know. Crump's point was not subtle. Someone is not telling the complete truth about what happened before that boat left. For Christine Wansley, the emotional collapse of the day began with silence. She did not hear from her son that evening. On a holiday, some delays may not seem immediately alarming, but a mother knows the difference between ordinary delay and something that feels wrong. Christine tracked Nolan's phone, but that only told her where the device was, not where Nolan himself was. That distinction would become one of the most agonizing in the case. She filed a missing person report the night of July 4th. One of Nolan's friends also contacted authorities. By then, darkness was closing in, and the opportunity for a full-scale search over open water that same night was shrinking by the minute. What had begun as a summer holiday had already transformed into every parent's nightmare, and before midnight the family was living in a reality that no amount of reassurance could soften. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department, led by Sheriff John Ledbetter, launched a formal search operation. The scope of that response made clear that authorities understood the seriousness of the situation from the start. Multiple agencies joined the effort, including the U.S. Coast Guard, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, and rangers from the Gulf Islands National Seashore, which oversees Horn Island as federal land. The terrain was difficult. Horn Island has no roads, no infrastructure, and no lights once darkness falls. Searching it is not like searching a neighborhood or even a typical beach. It is a protected, isolated stretch of sand and water where distance and exposure work against rescuers. The United Cajun Navy, the well-known volunteer emergency response group, also entered the effort. Its national vice president, Brian Troshers, said his organization had been in direct contact with Christine from the moment Nolan was reported missing. Warren Hudson, who said he had already contacted the Coast Guard after returning to the mainland, went back out the following morning with other family members and friends to assist in the search. He later described an intense operation with helicopters overhead, planes in the air, officers on the water, and law enforcement covering the island on foot. According to his account, it did not look like a limited or casual response. It looked like every available resource had been mobilized. Search efforts continued through July 5th and into July 6th. Then, at approximately 8:45 a.m. on July 6th, a United States Park Ranger located a body in the water near the northwestern tip of Horn Island. Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lind was notified and confirmed that the remains matched Nolan's description. Sheriff Ledbetter later told CNN the body had been found near the west end of the island. There were no immediately visible signs of physical injury. The official autopsy was conducted on July 7th by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office. That part was expected. What followed was what deeply unsettled the family. The results of that autopsy, including toxicology findings, were not released publicly. More painfully, according to the family, they were not given the information they needed to understand how Nolan died. The silence that followed became one of the defining features of the case. Christine Wansley posted publicly about her devastation, describing her son as a special soul and saying her heart was broken for the young man who had spent his life lifting others up. Those were not the words of a family preparing to quietly accept an unexplained death. They were the words of a mother already making it clear that she was not going to be handed a vague ending and told to live with it. The Wells family publicly demanded a thorough and transparent investigation. They did not want assumptions. They did not want incomplete answers. They did not want to be told what likely happened without evidence that could withstand scrutiny. While they were still grieving, the investigation itself was already growing in scale and complexity. Sheriff Ledbetter confirmed that the FBI's Jackson Field office had joined the case. At first, that involvement was framed as a collaborative step related to the review of digital evidence. Because Horn Island falls under federal jurisdiction as part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore, law enforcement cooperation between local authorities and federal agencies was presented as normal procedure. On paper, that explanation sounded routine. But then the FBI issued its own statement, and the story changed shape. The Bureau confirmed to ABC News that it was also actively addressing interstate threats made against individuals tied to the case. That is not just administrative support. That is a separate federal matter entirely. Interstate threats fall under federal law, and the FBI does not step in simply to soothe tensions. That statement made it clear that federal involvement was happening on two fronts at once. One related to evidence, and one related to threats serious enough to warrant criminal attention across state lines. That distinction mattered, because it meant the pressure around Nolan's death had escalated beyond public debate and emotional outrage into a threat environment that federal authorities considered actionable. In other words, this was no longer just a tragic mystery. It was becoming a case surrounded by fear, intimidation, and a level of volatility that went far beyond internet noise. Christine Wansley later made that reality even more chilling when she publicly shared that someone had sent a message to her home. She photographed it and posted it on Facebook, writing that whoever sent it needed to reflect on what they had done. She did not need to spell out every detail for the public to grasp the cruelty of the moment. The mother of a dead 18-year-old, still without official answers about how her child died, was receiving threatening material at her own residence. It was a horrifying development, and in the context of the FBI's involvement, it signaled that this case had attracted not just attention, but dangerous obsession. It also underscored how impossible it had become to separate the investigation itself from the atmosphere growing around it. On the evidence side, Ben Crump and the Wells family's legal team launched an independent investigation into Nolan's cell phone. Crump stated publicly that messages had been deleted from the device. He did not specify when those deletions occurred, who might have been responsible, or what the missing communications contained. Law enforcement has not publicly confirmed that claim, so it remains unverified in the official record. Still, the very fact that the family felt compelled to pursue its own digital review said a great deal about how little confidence they had in passively waiting for official conclusions. Crump also said his team was receiving between 50 and 100 calls a day from people who had either been on Horn Island or knew something about the people who were. The sheriff's department, meanwhile, had already interviewed more than 60 witnesses. That number alone shows just how broad and complex the social web around this case had become. Sheriff Ledbetter confirmed that the 3 friends who traveled with Nolan on the boat had each been interviewed in depth. But even after dozens of statements and growing national attention, the central contradictions remained alive. Then a new piece of evidence entered the picture. Dispatch audio from a private towing company recorded on the afternoon of July 4th. In the audio, a caller connected to the boat used by Nolan's friends can be heard urgently reporting that the vessel was taking on water. The caller requests assistance. When asked whether everyone on board is accounted for, the caller confirms that everyone on the boat is safe. Nolan was not on the boat at the time of that call. That recording, combined with the GPS data already obtained from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, gave investigators a more fixed and objective timeline for the boat's movements and the conditions during the return trip. The GPS record established when the boat left Horn Island. The dispatch call confirmed that the vessel was in distress while heading back. Together, those pieces create a time-stamped framework that does not depend on memory, friendship, fear, or changing public narratives. They do not explain what happened to Nolan in the hour before departure, but they narrow the space in which certain claims can be tested. In a case where every human account seems shadowed by contradiction, that kind of hard timeline is crucial. It means that at least part of the story can be pinned down with something more reliable than recollection. The Mississippi Department of Marine Resources later became another focal point when reports emerged that the agency had accidentally released records tied to Nolan's death before being contacted by the district attorney's office. Once the office of Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath was notified, and DMR was instructed to withhold further records under the exemption used for active criminal investigations. The agency complied and confirmed it would not release more while the case remained open. McElrath later addressed the public directly and said the case was a priority for her office. She explained that when the investigation concludes, the matter will go before a grand jury, which she described as standard Mississippi procedure for deaths not determined to be natural. She emphasized that the grand jury would decide whether charges were warranted based on the evidence presented. On July 15th, Ben Crump met with McElrath alongside the Wells family. After that meeting, Crump said publicly that the district attorney had committed to placing every relevant fact before the grand jury, holding back nothing and overlooking nothing. The grand jury had not yet convened at that point, but the list of material expected to go before it was already substantial. It included GPS data, dispatch audio, witness interviews, digital evidence, autopsy findings, and whatever might ultimately emerge from the family's independent phone examination. That is a huge body of information, yet all of it circles the same unresolved core. What exactly happened on Horn Island between roughly 3 p.m. and 4:31 p.m. on July 4th, 2026? What occurred in that final hour that no one has fully and credibly explained? There is another layer to this case that became impossible to ignore almost immediately. In photographs from that day, Nolan Xavier Wells appears to have been the only Black person in his immediate group. Under ordinary circumstances, that detail might not have drawn much attention. But in Mississippi, with a young Black man dead under unexplained circumstances and the people around him offering accounts that do not fully align, the broader historical context came rushing in fast. Mississippi carries a documented racial history that shadows every modern case involving a Black victim and unanswered questions. That context does not prove anything by itself, but it absolutely shapes the way the public hears official statements, processes delays, and reacts to premature conclusions. In Nolan's case, that tension became part of the story almost immediately. Sheriff Ledbetter made an early public statement suggesting that foul play was not suspected. That comment landed badly with many observers because it came before the state autopsy had been released, before witness interviews were complete, before digital evidence had been publicly examined, and before the family had been given clear answers. Reverend Al Sharpton publicly challenged that framing, arguing that authorities should not signal the absence of foul play before an investigation had actually established it. To Sharpton, that kind of statement was not neutral caution. It was an early presumption. And for a grieving family already struggling against silence, it felt like the kind of presumption that can shape the public conversation before the facts even have a chance to breathe. Sharpton stood beside Christine Wansley at a July 10th press conference at the National Action Network headquarters in New York and gave voice to the questions the family had been asking since the night Nolan did not come home. Why did the group leave the island without him? Why were his phone and keys on the boat while he was not? Why was there a delay before his disappearance was formally reported? Sharpton did not present those points as theatrical accusations. He presented them as obvious investigative questions that had to be answered before anyone could responsibly move toward closure. In doing so, he effectively nationalized the case. The questions were no longer confined to Mississippi. They were now being asked from one of the country's best-known civil rights platforms. At Nolan's funeral service, held at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs, Sharpton delivered the eulogy. He spoke openly about the inconsistencies in the public narrative and the disturbing absence of clear answers. He argued that the nation was watching because the nation recognized the pattern of anxiety that forms when a young black man dies under unclear circumstances in Mississippi, and officials appear to move slowly while speaking too confidently. Sharpton also pledged $50,000 from the National Action Network toward a reward fund for information leading to an arrest and conviction if it were ultimately determined that a crime had occurred. That reward transformed public frustration into a standing appeal for actionable information. It made clear that the people surrounding this case did not intend to let it fade quietly into procedural fog. Tyler Perry soon entered the story in a way that gave the case even more national visibility. He paid for Nolan's funeral expenses in full and made public statements expressing solidarity with the family. Perry said he understood the pain of needing answers for a loved one and not receiving them, calling that kind of uncertainty debilitating. He said it was his hope that Christine and Elmore Wansley would ultimately learn the truth of what happened to their son. Perry also contributed to the reward fund. Former NFL star Terrell Owens did the same. By July 22nd, when Ben Crump announced the total at the NAACP National Convention in Chicago, the reward had reached $125,000. That figure, jointly funded by Sharpton, Perry, and Owens, was available to anyone whose information led to an arrest and conviction if a crime was established. Colin Kaepernick's involvement took a different form, but it may prove even more consequential. He privately funded the independent autopsy commissioned by the Wells family. That move was not symbolic. It was a direct response to the state's continued silence. The Wells family had also assembled a broader legal team beyond Ben Crump alone, including attorneys Carlos Moore and Eric Hirsch. The growing circle of public figures, civil rights leaders, athletes, and attorneys made one thing impossible to deny. This was no longer just a local tragedy playing out inside Jackson County. The case had become a national referendum on transparency, credibility, urgency, and whether families like Nolan still have to fight for the basic dignity of a full and honest investigation. On July 21st, 2026, Nolan Xavier Wells was laid to rest in Ocean Springs. His family, friends, teammates, coaches, and community gathered to say goodbye to an 18-year-old who should have been preparing for football camp, not a funeral. Christine Wansley spoke during the service and said Nolan had a gift for making people feel seen, welcomed, and valued. He could boost someone's confidence with only a few words. He made people feel like they belonged. After the burial, loved ones gathered to celebrate his life in a way that reflected the energy and warmth he had brought to others. But even in the middle of mourning, the family was already preparing for the next public stage of their fight. The morning after the funeral, Nolan's parents flew to Chicago. At the NAACP National Convention on July 22nd, Ben Crump stood before a packed room and announced the results of the independent autopsy. Christine and Elmore Wansley stood beside him. The setting was emotionally charged, not because anyone was pretending certainty existed, but because the family had been forced into a position where they were seeking answers on a national stage while the official process remained silent. The independent autopsy was conducted by forensic pathologist Dr. Roger Mitchell, a physician with substantial experience in high-profile death investigations. His examination was careful and professionally restrained. His conclusion was that both the cause and manner of Nolan's death were undetermined pending further investigation. In forensic language, that is not a throwaway term. It carries real weight. It means the available evidence does not support a final conclusion in either direction. Dr. Mitchell's report stated that there was no evidence of fractures and no deep tissue injuries. Those findings mattered because they clarified what the body did not show during the examination. But the report also noted a red discoloration on the back of Nolan's skull. Dr. Mitchell described that finding as inconclusive and said it required further investigation before any responsible interpretation could be made. That one detail became one of the most closely watched points in the case, not because it proved anything on its own, but because it signaled that there were still physical observations needing explanation. In a case where certainty remains elusive, any unresolved detail gains enormous importance. The most consequential line in Dr. Mitchell's report was his statement that, without further information, he could not rule out the possibility that non-accidental factors contributed to or caused Nolan's death. That wording has to be read carefully. It is not a ruling of homicide. It is not an accusation. It is not a declaration that someone attacked Nolan. But it is also very far from a conclusion of accidental drowning. It places the case in a deeply unsettled forensic middle space. Mitchell was effectively saying that, based on the evidence available to him, he could not exclude the possibility that something other than an accident was involved. That is a meaningful statement, especially in a case where some early public commentary appeared to lean toward dismissing foul play before all evidence had been aired. Dr. Mitchell also acknowledged the limitations that come with examining a body recovered from open water after 2 days. In those conditions, certain findings become harder to interpret. Some injuries, patterns, or indicators may not present with the clarity they would under different circumstances. Those limitations do not undermine the autopsy. They simply define the conditions under which the conclusions must be understood. Ben Crump used the Chicago appearance to make 2 specific requests. First, he said Dr. Mitchell should be included when the case is presented to the grand jury. Second, he requested that the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office share its autopsy photographs and direct observations with Dr. Mitchell so that the independent review could be as informed and complete as possible. As of that point, the state's autopsy results, including toxicology, still had not been released publicly. Elmore Wansley gave voice to the most devastating truth in the room when he said his son should have been at football practice. Not buried, not discussed at a convention, not at the center of forensic uncertainty. At football practice. That one line distilled the entire tragedy into a single unbearable contrast between the life Nolan was building and the void now swallowing it. Christine said the silence from the state had been heartbreaking and that the family's decision to seek outside help had come from necessity, not spectacle. They were not pursuing public attention for its own sake. They were pursuing what they believed was the only path left toward truth. When institutions that hold the answers refuse to speak, families often feel forced to turn grief into public pressure. The unreleased toxicology findings from the state autopsy remain one of the most significant unknowns in the entire investigation. When those results are eventually made public, they could prove crucial in shaping how Nolan's final hours are understood. Until then, the vacuum around them continues to fuel distrust. In a case already defined by delayed answers, conflicting witness accounts, and federal involvement, the withholding of toxicology only intensifies the sense that key pieces of the story remain locked away, while the family is left to endure uncertainty in plain view. At this point, the case exists in the uneasy territory between established fact and unresolved interpretation. Some core facts are no longer in dispute. Nolan Wells was on Horn Island on July 4, 2026. He was last seen between 3 and 4 p.m. His phone and keys were on the boat when it departed at 4:31 p.m. He was not. His body was found on the morning of July 6th in the water off the northwestern tip of Horn Island. The independent autopsy commissioned by his family concluded that the cause and manner of death were undetermined and stated that non-accidental factors could not be ruled out. The state autopsy has not been publicly released, and its toxicology findings remain unavailable. Those are the hard facts around which everything else turns. What remains contested is the story surrounding Nolan's final hour on the island. Did he choose to stay behind? Did he intend to catch a different ride? Did the people around him misunderstand his plan? Did anyone knowingly leave him in a vulnerable position? Warren Hudson says Nolan declined multiple opportunities to get on the boat. Warren Cole's reported account suggests Nolan said he planned to return with someone else. Katie McCormick's account, through her sister, says she believed he was heading back to his own boat. Those explanations are not impossible to reconcile in some loose theoretical sense, but they do not naturally fit together either. They describe three different understandings of Nolan's intentions, and until those gaps are resolved, the public and the family are left staring at the same unanswered question from different angles. The phone issue remains one of the most emotionally loaded details in the case. It is confirmed that Nolan's phone stayed on the boat. Hudson said leaving phones behind near the water was normal behavior in that group. No other named person has publicly and clearly corroborated or contradicted that explanation on the record. But even if the explanation is true, it does not answer everything. If Nolan truly expected to leave with another group, how did he end up with no communication after his original boat departed? If his friends thought he had another ride, who was supposed to be responsible for making sure that happened? If Katie believed he was getting back on his own boat, why did no one clarify otherwise before leaving? The unanswered questions keep multiplying because every attempted explanation creates a new blank space. The confusion surrounding the viral video is another example of how quickly narratives in this case have formed and fractured. Ben Crump's early belief that the video may have captured Nolan's voice gave that footage immediate emotional weight. Traces Tin Shepard's later statement that the voice was his and that the incident was unrelated to Nolan should have clarified things, but instead it mostly demonstrated how unstable the public information environment had become. In a case this combustible, mistaken interpretations do not vanish once corrected. They continue circulating in fragments, feeding suspicion even after the facts change. Crump's public claim that messages were deleted from Nolan's phone remains one of the most potentially explosive, but still unverified developments. If future digital analysis supports that allegation, it could significantly alter the direction of the investigation. If it does not, it will remain another example of how this case has repeatedly moved ahead of itself in the public imagination. Either way, the device has become a major piece of the story, not just because of what it may contain, but because it symbolizes the broader struggle between official silence and independent scrutiny. There are additional details that further complicate the public picture. Both Warren Hudson and Wyatt Pyron have retained private defense attorneys. The boat linked to the July 4th trip, owned through Wyatt Pyron's family, was formally searched after Jerry Utterson voluntarily signed the permission document. GPS data was taken from that vessel. Investigators also extracted data from a separate boat belonging to Bart Edmond Jr. before Katie McCormick was correctly identified as the woman Nolan had spent time with. Investigators pursued an incorrect lead involving another woman named Lainey. These may sound like side details, but they show how fragmented and unstable the early picture of the case really was. Even some of the most basic questions about who was with Nolan and how exactly people moved between groups had to be sorted out after the fact. One other detail has attracted attention because it remains officially unexplained. Surveillance footage from Warren Hudson's dock on the morning of July 4th showed nearly 24 people preparing to leave across 3 boats. But when that footage is compared with the boat Nolan appears on in photographs taken later at Horn Island, the vessels do not seem to match cleanly. That discrepancy has not been publicly resolved by law enforcement or by anyone in the group. In a case where the timeline already depends on understanding who is on which boat and when, that unresolved visual inconsistency has only added to public skepticism. By late July 2026, more than 60 witnesses had been interviewed. District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath was moving the case toward a grand jury. The reward fund stood at $125,000. The FBI was working both digital evidence and interstate threat angles. The independent autopsy had returned an undetermined finding and could not exclude non-accidental factors. The state autopsy remained unreleased. 2 members of the group had retained defense attorneys. And still, The accounts from the people closest to Nolan's final hours had not been reconciled into one believable, coherent sequence of events. That is why the case continues to grip the public so powerfully. Not because the known facts are weak, but because the known facts are strong enough to reveal how much is still missing. At the heart of everything remains the same brutal question. What happened on Horn Island between roughly 3 p.m. and 4:31 p.m. on July 4th, 2026? What was said? What was assumed? What was ignored? Who saw Nolan last in a meaningful way? Who knew he was still there when the boat pulled away? Who believed someone else would bring him back? And who, among the people on that island, knows more than they have admitted? Those are not dramatic embellishments. They are the unresolved core of the case. Until that final hour is fully accounted for, every statement will feel partial, every reassurance will feel premature, and every official delay will feel heavier than it otherwise might. The case is not closed. Not by law enforcement, not by the Wells family, not by the legal team representing them, not by the FBI now active in multiple capacities. The file remains open, and the people with the power to eventually close it have made clear that they are not finished. Beneath every public appearance, every legal filing, every reward announcement, every rumor, every theory, and every headline is a much simpler and much sadder truth. 2 parents sent their son out for a holiday and never got him back. They still do not have a definitive state explanation for how he died. They still do not know exactly what occurred between the last confirmed sighting of Nolan on Horn Island and the discovery of his body 2 days later in the water. What they have received instead is a devastating mixture of institutional silence and online noise. The institutions that owe them answers have moved slowly and cautiously. The internet, which owes them nothing, has moved recklessly and nonstop. Somewhere between those two extremes, the truth remains trapped. Christine and Elmore Wansley have made it painfully clear that they believe their son deserves better than that. They have said it consistently in every public appearance, every statement, and every plea for accountability. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old. He was a football player with a camp start date just days away. His coach said he led without needing to dominate a room. His principal said he was one of the best students to come through the school. His mother said his heart was too big for a world that would not always return the same kindness. His father said he taught him one rule over and over: if you go with a group, you stay with the group. Nolan did not make it home. The truth about why still has not surfaced in full, and that is exactly why this case refuses to go quiet. Every new detail sharpens part of the picture, while leaving the center unresolved. The boat's timeline is clearer. The dispatch audio is clearer. The witness pool is larger. The federal role is no longer a rumor. The celebrity support is established. The legal pressure is mounting. The reward is real. The contradictions remain. And until the grand jury hears everything, until the state releases what it has withheld, until the digital evidence is fully understood, until every account is tested against the record, the case will continue hanging in that painful space between grief and proof. That is the reality of where things stand now. The funeral has happened, but closure has not. The search is over, but the real fight is not. The headlines have multiplied, but the essential answers have not arrived. Horn Island still sits off the Mississippi coast, quiet and sunlit and beautiful from a distance, while one unaccounted-for hour on its shoreline continues to carry the weight of an entire case. Until that hour is honestly explained, the story remains unfinished. And until the truth finally breaks through the silence, Nolan Wells remains not just a name in a tragedy, but the center of a question that Mississippi, the witnesses, the investigators, and the public still have not answered. If this case matters to you, then the next development will matter too, because what comes next could change how everything is understood. The state toxicology findings, the grand jury presentation, the independent phone review, the witness contradictions, the federal threat investigation, all of it is building toward a moment when the scattered pieces may finally be forced into one official narrative. The only question is whether that narrative will satisfy the family, withstand public scrutiny, and truly explain why Nolan Wells left for a holiday trip and never returned. Until then, the case remains painfully open, emotionally charged, and impossible to forget.